Hello. Good evening, everybody. I am so delighted to be here with you tonight. Thank you for coming out for this event because we're here to talk about a pretty wonderful book called Challenging Confinement, Mass Incarceration, and the Fight for Equality in Women's Prisons. So thank you for coming up to be with us tonight from Indiana.
Thank you for having me. And it's so nice to see so many people here who have worked on these issues for such a long time. It's really humbling. And I'm excited for a great conversation.
Me too. I wanted to kick things off by asking you how you got interested in what's happening to women, or what has happened and what's happening now to women in U.S. prisons.
I first became interested in thinking about the history of prisons and women in particular. My first job out of college was working at the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, and I visited a lot of prisons around the South and the Midwest, working as a paralegal on some of those cases. And I regularly would go to the women's prison in Alabama. And going there and meeting with incarcerated women made me curious just about the history of why there are separate women's prisons and some of the issues that they were facing that were unique to some of the male clients. And once I got to graduate school, there really wasn't a lot of literature on women in prison, especially from historians and sociologists at the time that I was in school. And I really wanted to be writing about mass incarceration and the history of prisons. And that frustration made me curious about what was happening with women in prison, especially as it intersects with different moments of women's rights and different fights for social justice that were led by women in the 20th century. And as I was reading more, Michigan was a key site for a lot of reform and changes in terms of how incarceration worked for women, especially in the late 20th century. And it was where the first major class action lawsuit was filed by incarcerated women and arguing for gender equality, access to the courts, access to education, access to better work training, and the idea was better opportunities once people were released from prison. So that made me really excited and interested in reading more about the history of incarceration in Michigan and women in particular, which is what the book really focuses on.
Well, since you brought it up, I actually wanted to ask you to read a particular passage from your remarkable book. And if you would, please, this is the start of chapter 2.
Sure. So this is, the beginning of chapter 2, from mass action to class action. In 1976, the Detroit House of Correction received a woman whose name would become synonymous with the fight for gender equality in American prisons. Just 21 years old, Mary Glover faced 3 concurrent life sentences, and her new home was bleak. She recalled, "On arrival at the prison, I could not believe my eyes. The 180-bed institution was completely uninhabitable. The building had been condemned, and the housing cottages were filthy. I was processed as a new commitment and taken to the hospital dining room for lunch. It was crawling with cockroaches and mice. They fed me black, burned hot dogs and beans. It was hot and muggy. Flies were everywhere. I was sick and in shock. The mattress in her cell reeked of urine. In the winter, incarcerated women tried to stay warm despite sporadic heat. They suffered through sweltering temperatures in the summer. Like prisons across the country, incarcerated women in Michigan navigated dilapidated and overcrowded buildings. They lacked access to education, vocational training, and legal services, which made them vulnerable to arbitrary and cruel punishment. In contrast, incarcerated men could enroll in college courses and get job training in factories and farms. These discrepancies fueled discontent and inspired activism in Michigan's only women's prison."
Thank you so much. I wanted you to read that passage because I think it describes so well what so many people in the general public don't know about what's happening in prisons, and specifically to women. When we think of people being sent to prison, people tend to focus a lot on what happens in courtrooms and on the idea of crime, but they don't tend to think that much about what we've actually sentenced people to. And the women that you describe in this book are doing such extraordinary work to make people understand what is actually happening to the folks inside. So, why did you decide to tell their stories in this way?
Well, a lot of, especially in history, there's a lot of literature that focuses on mass incarceration as this intersecting causal factors, but one that creates a lot of victims. And I wanted to think through how people resisted aspects of mass incarceration and fought back and tried to advocate for themselves, even from inside prison. So in the book, I really do try to talk to people who experienced incarceration, get a sense of what it was actually like to be facing long sentences, but also think through how women advocated for themselves and tried to either improve or reform or abolish practices inside the prison, and kind of had a lot of agency even in these really restricted, confined environments. And I think that what I'm trying to do is kind of contribute to the scholarship in that way by thinking about people who are incarcerated as whole people who are still working to improve their lives and improve the lives of their communities and the people that they're incarcerated with.
I think that's at the heart of the Glover v. Johnson case that you describe for a good stretch of the book, because it becomes such an extraordinary legal precedent and sets off change for women in prison around the country. Could you talk a little bit about the Glover decision, what it was, and what it means continuing to this day in our legal history?
Sure. So the Glover case was huge in that it set precedent. It was a case that kind of fits well within the prison rights movement of the 1970s and 1980s, in that incarcerated people started advocating for themselves and finding some legal arguments that gained traction in federal courts, where they were launching lawsuits suing state actors to try to bring about change in state institutions. So this worked really well in prisons in some ways, and that it also comes at a moment when federal judges are moving away from kind of a hands-off policy to prisons and starting to take a more activist approach. So with the Glover case, my understanding of it is that it was also something that was kind of a grassroots mobilization of how people interpreted the women's movements of the 1970s, and that they felt like they were being treated very unfairly, and they were. They were navigating curriculums that had been pretty static since the 1920s. They had home economics courses that were not helpful at all in finding jobs or gaining skills while incarcerated. So they put together a lawsuit working with some attorneys who had been offering volunteer courses in the prison, who also, once they were coming into the prison, realized how terrible the conditions were. Plaster was falling from the ceiling. They were really appalled and shocked at what they were hearing from the women each week when they met for their class. And so women brought this case to the federal court in the Eastern District of Michigan, and they were arguing for gender equality. They wanted access to education, access to the courts, a better law library, vocational training. And it was pretty ambitious and also quite risky. A lot of the women listed their names as Jane Doe or Mary Doe because they were very afraid of retaliation. And they were successful in court after a very long trial. It was a huge victory. That initial decision, federal judge John Fikens, he decided that the women were being discriminated against based on gender, and it opened the door to a lot of possibilities for reform. In the book, that is a major narrative, kind of thinking through that victory, that kind of hope and possibility that the women created. And then the hard thing is the state really kind of dug in its heels and didn't want to create a lot of the programming that was proposed or the opportunities that could have come out of a decision like that. So there's this kind of moment in the 70s where this sets precedent for other cases around the country. Other states settle with incarcerated women because they don't want to be dragged into a long period of litigation over these civil issues. And I still think the case is really important. And one of the things that I track in the book is that so many women that had either named themselves in the lawsuit or had worked on it in some capacity continued to advocate for improving other aspects of life in prison, or continue to work on some kind of social justice aspect around mass incarceration after they were released. So even though there were some setbacks with the actual case in terms of how the state eventually settled in the early 2000s, the legacy of the case is really important because the lead plaintiff and other incarcerated women continued to work on these issues and still do in many instances.
It's amazing how far this case has carried into the lives of a lot of the people in this room. For those of you who don't know, the named lead plaintiff is sitting in the front row. She was then known as Mary Glover. She's known today as Mary Heinen McPherson. And it was her lawsuit that helped to change the way that women live in Michigan prisons and then all over the country when similar lawsuits were filed to follow this one. But one of the things you mentioned as you were talking right now is how dug in the state was to resist what the women in prison had done. Could you talk a little bit about how the state tried to thwart the incredible victories that came from these court cases? Because Glover v. Johnson was just the first one. It wasn't the only one of the class action lawsuits filed by the women.
Yeah, it was the first and significant one, and there were a number of others where women tried to achieve other things through the courts. What happened is just a series of appeals and kind of a revolving door in and out of the court where the state is saying that they have met the initial order and the plaintiffs are saying, no, they haven't. There's still all these problems. And that goes on for years, which must have been so frustrating. And it's well documented how the state kind of refused to implement programs or implement them to the level that was initially proposed or have kind of open dialogue with the incarcerated women who had a real vision for what might be possible with the victory after Glover v. Johnson. And what I think a key thing of Glover that Judge Fiken set up was this issue of parity, that the women had to have access to, even though they were at one state institution, they had to have access to all opportunities and programs that were available to men across a network and different kind of categories of security for men's prisons. So what they eventually start doing is removing those programs in men's prisons so that they meet the rule of parity. And so there's this real kind of leveling down of programming for incarcerated men and women in this period of retrenchment and a lot of animosity that the state initiates and kind of, as I said, digs in its heels and refuses to really meet the possibility and opportunities that initial Glover order put in place.
And isn't that just like the logic of a prison, to continue to try to dismantle people's human and civil rights instead of doing what the courts had ordered? One of my favorite passages in the book is a moment when Judge Fikens, who must have been an extraordinary character, I really wish I could have met him, actually insisted on going to see the conditions that the women lived in. And he starts yelling at people in the prison and saying, you have to put up a shower curtain around where the women have to use the toilet because there are male guards here, and you have to do this and you have to do that. And if you don't do it yourself within the next 48 hours, he threatened to come and do it himself. And people don't tend to address the prison as an institution or the people who run it in that tone. And I think part of what I found really moving about this book is that you illuminate the ways in which all of this actually, Fikens is a person who has some power, who can actually get some things done, but the women themselves are coming from this place of really severe oppression and finding ways to get their legal and human rights considered for the first time in Lord only knows how long. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you found most inspiring about the women who become the protagonists of this book?
Yeah, I think that anecdote that you've just described is something that I learned from Charlene Snow, who is one of the attorneys who worked on the case. And I think it also highlights one thing I really tried to do in the book was make connections and talk to people who lived through this history. Because when I initially started doing archival research, prior to meeting some of the people in here today, Judge Fikens had unfortunately just passed away, so it wouldn't have been an option for me when I started working on this project to talk to him. But his his papers were all donated to Wayne State University, and they gave me permission to go through them even though they weren't cataloged. So I was so excited to see what might be there when it comes to prison litigation, because he oversaw Glover versus Johnson, but a number of other prison cases in Michigan. And when I got there, almost all of the files were about a water treatment plant. There was so little available about prison litigation and Glover versus Johnson, even though he was the judge that was on this case for decades. And while it gave me an insight in the newspapers, he was often referred to as the sludge judge. I now understood why he gained that nickname, but I was really frustrated because the archives there were these big gaps. So talking to people like Mary and Carol and other attorneys and formerly incarcerated people and currently incarcerated people filled in so much, texture and stories, and just giving me a sense about what actually happened and kind of what the conditions were like, how they decided to act and kind of advocate for themselves and create these interracial coalitions to try to bring about change. It really added a lot that's not available in the state records or in the existing records. And in terms of what I found inspiring, there's so many things. It's really hard to pick just one. But I think in talking to people who are formerly incarcerated and just hearing about their decisions to, put themselves out there as a leader and as someone that other incarcerated people could talk to, and as someone who, they took on so much and also put themselves in a vulnerable place in a really violent and severe institution. And I think that is so inspiring to kind of think through how they wanted to put themselves in that position, but also how they really were very committed to bringing about change, or they knew that what was happening inside this prison was not right and someone had to do something about it, and they knew that they would be well equipped to be that person. And I think that's incredibly inspiring. And I really wanted to capture that in some of the stories in the book.
I'm so grateful that you got to talk to so many of these folks, because I tell my students that Mary, who co-teaches with me at Michigan, is the living archive, because she can tell us things, and other people who've come home from prison can tell us things that nobody else can tell us, because those records don't exist. Their stories are not recorded officially by the prison system. If you actually look at the Michigan Department of Corrections or any other state prison system's records, you can get a lot of information that I wouldn't say is irrelevant, but doesn't give you a clear picture of who a person is. So I could look up anybody in prison today and find out what all their tattoos are on the Michigan Department of Corrections website, because they're very interested in identifying marks. It will list all their court cases and convictions and dates connected to those, but it doesn't tell you anything about who this person is, or what their lives in prison have been like, or how they've been treated, or what it looks like to have to survive in a prison each day. And that's what the women behind all of the cases that you describe in the book are really trying to tell their stories in the courts, in the narratives that they've given to you and to other people, in the kinds of documentary films that Carol Jacobson has made. They're trying to get the word out into the world. And so I'm really grateful that your book is helping to do that work and put some faces on some of these women. Could you tell us about one or a couple of the women who we don't get to meet tonight, who are featured in the book?
Sure. I guess, a couple of them come up in the archival information that I've been able to dig up. Juanita Thomas comes to mind. Her story is really central to the anti-domestic violence movement. She was convicted for killing a longtime abusive partner kind of in the middle of a fight. And she was the first woman to receive clemency from the Women's Justice and Clemency Project in Michigan. You're shaking your head. Right. Yes, I misspoke. Yeah, I remember. She had filed a petition, but it was kind of through the advocacy of the Clemency Project that she was released, and kind of a result of that work. Yes, thank you for correcting me. But I tell her story in one of the chapters, kind of alongside a woman, Francine Hughes, whose story made national headlines. She had also inspired a television show, but she was acquitted. She was a white woman who had burned her house down while her husband was passed out in the bed, and it became known as the burning bed. And her story really put domestic violence and intimate partner violence kind of on the map in a lot of ways. But Francine Hughes and Juanita Thomas were facing criminal charges in the trial in a short period of time in the same courthouse with the same prosecutor, and had very different outcomes. So in the chapter, I'm trying to unpack some of the racialized ways that justice is handed out. And Juanita Thomas really advocated for herself while she was incarcerated, and she really kept at it and kept trying to find better representation. She had a public defender who didn't provide good lawyering at the initial trial, and she knew that and kind of kept working on the case and kept advocating for herself. So in each chapter, I try to present a woman's story as kind of representative or symbolic of some of these major shifts in terms of thinking about different aspects of women's movements in the 20th century, and then also thinking about how all of those are also impacting the prison. Because we often think about the prison as an isolated institution. And in the book, I'm trying to think about how broader social movements and conversations about women and gender are also really impacting how incarcerated women are thinking of themselves, but also thinking about the institution.
And why is domestic violence such a huge issue when we talk about women's incarceration?
So many women have had some kind of experience with domestic violence or intimate partner violence that it was a really common experience. And as the law changes in the 70s and 80s, a lot of incarcerated women are realizing that some of this information should have been brought up at their initial trial, and the movement helped them kind of reconceptualize their sense of justice on individual cases, but also kind of broader societal norms and ways that violence impacts women in different ways. And so for incarcerated women, my understanding in talking to incarcerated women or formerly incarcerated women is that it was a really common experience. And as the anti-violence movements start to really take off in the 70s and 80s, it also brings about some changes in terms of how women can talk about their own personal history, but also their own cases, which is really important.
I think it also is one of the ways in which prisons affect women very differently than men. So men don't tend to get locked up for killing an abuser in the same way that women do, and yet women are often given really long sentences because they consider it premeditated if you do something to be able to take out a person who's usually larger or stronger than you. So the lasting consequences of how we sentence women with domestic violence also strike me as really significant in how we talk about all of these things. And then, as your book so clearly describes, a lot of these women are going from a place where they were enduring severe violence into yet another place where we continue to heap severe violence upon them. And it's only through their own stories, through their own court cases, that comes to light at all. We tend to ignore how the circumstances that sent people to prison mirror and reflect some of the things that are happening to them while they're in prison too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even it's making me reflect on Juanita Thomas, who wrote a bit about her own experience when she was released, and had said something like, she wrote that she should have gotten some time, but not life in prison. So kind of thinking about how without information about the violence or the kind of the nuances of a particular case, there are these instances where women get sentenced really harshly because all of that information was never brought up in the initial trial.
And I think that the things that we learn about people in trial circumstances are so different than the things that the women are telling about themselves in this book and in other places where we get to hear their voices. And that struggle to be heard, to tell the real human stories of what's happening to people inside, is so vital to our ability to have a more just world than the one in which we live. Could you reflect a little bit on the end of the book? You give us a few tidbits about where these women have landed. Some of them are still in prison, some of them are not. How did the litigation and the struggles that you describe shape the lives of the women who were the protagonists of these battles?
My understanding is that it, profoundly impacted their lives, and it still might be some things some of the women I've talked to are still processing. And one way to kind of process that, if they've been released from prison, is a lot of people feel this obligation to keep working on social justice around mass incarceration, or keep working on that in some capacity. So some of the women are working with young people who have had contact with the criminal legal system. Some people like Mary are going into the prisons and offering courses and arts, and really in touch with people who are incarcerated and trying to make sure that people have programming in your work as well. And I think that is a really important piece that often gets left out in scholarship on mass incarceration, is thinking about how people continue to work on these issues. It's not, the story doesn't end the second someone is released from prison, which often, I think, historians sometimes focus on the trial and then when someone's released. But in the book, that final epilogue, I try to bring it up at least close to the present, and think about how so many people who have gone through reentry, that's also changing our conversations about prisons and about the criminal legal system and about incarceration, because it's impacted so many people directly. And then kind of having broader conversations about the impact of mass incarceration in their work, it kind of continues to revive some of these issues that came up for women while incarcerated, but also keeps those issues alive after they've left prison.
For our own, our local audience may appreciate knowing exactly how some of this work has impacted us at the University of Michigan. So the Glover v. Johnson case happened in 70, what year? 70. So in 1979, Judge Fikens and the courts at writ large said that women deserved access to higher education. It's not until the late 80s, right, that we get access to higher education for women in the state of Michigan. But when we did, my beloved colleague who has since passed, Dick Meisler, was appointed at the University of Michigan to be in charge of making sure the women got an education. And so he started sending people into the women's prison to teach. And at the same time, we had student proxies who were going into the prison to get their degrees alongside incarcerated women. So there were students who would sign up to take all the same classes as somebody they were paired with in the prison, and they would take the notes. And the women in prison had Walkmans if they were in the college program, which was a really big deal, that you got to listen to cassette tapes and have a Walkman, because nobody else in prison had those at the time. And they could take the same curriculum and get the same degree as students who were on our campus. But when the federal courts did away with, when the presidential administration did away with the loans, the student loans for incarcerated people in the early 90s, that program went away and never came back. So we can no longer offer college credit to people in Michigan prisons, but we do offer a lot of programming. And it all came out of a theater workshop that happened with Mary Glover at the time, who is now Mary Heinen McPherson, in the women's prison in 1990. So today at the Prison Creative Arts Project, we continue programming that was started because of the Glover v. Johnson case 34 years ago, and will be 35 years in January. So we are living the direct legacy of what the women in prison were able to do in the courts in the 1970s today here at Michigan. So Bonnie, thank you so much for writing this book and for preserving these histories and making these voices known to people who might not otherwise have access to them. I'm so glad that this exists now in the archive. And I wanted to open it up to all of you who came here tonight to ask questions or make comments, to talk to our visiting author. And we ask that if you say something, you please say it into the microphone so that the folks watching at home on the live stream can hear your question. So if you'd like to ask something, please raise your hand.
Raise your hand, and I've got the microphone.
Thanks. Well, thank you, and thank you, Bonnie. I'm so eager to read this book. I just wanted to mention one thing. The case of Juanita Thomas, we got 2 women out through court, only 2 over the 35 years that I've been doing this. And one was Juanita, and the other one was Violet Allen. And it was Violet Allen's case that was paired, that I've always paired with Francine Hughes, because Violet Allen's case was up before the same judge, and while Francine Hughes was able to get rid of the judge who made a discriminatory comment and in advance, and so he was kicked off from Francine Hughes' case, did not get kicked off Violet Allen's case, and she got life for killing her husband after he threw their baby across the room, and had beaten her bloody many times, many years. So those 3 cases are very linked in many ways because they had similar stories, and even and the 2 in the court that we got off through court in Ingham County, we got out because they were assigned the same prosecutor. When we got Juanita out, then I remember saying to the prosecutor, "We'll be back with Violet Allen." and he just rolled his eyes, but he was a decent guy, and he did recognize that both women got a raw deal. As, in my opinion, all the women in for murder got raw deals.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Carol.
Yeah, thank you. And I do talk about those cases in chapter 3 of the book, and I'm so grateful for your work, because I think so many of the films and law review articles and your work with those women, it gives scholars so much more to kind of think about and work with when it comes to, talking about the anti-violence movement in that period and also these really important cases.
Are there any other folks who would like to ask a question?
I'm
Yes.
coming.
The mic is traveling across the room.
Thank you. Do they teach about domestic violence or intimate partner violence in law school? Is that brought up, or is that something lawyers learn as they go along in their professional career?
I'm teaching in the law school now, co-teaching in the Federal Appellate Clinic. And I knocked on their door for years and would get an occasional student who would volunteer with the Clemency Project that I run. And finally, another professor who runs the Federal Appellate Clinic contacted me 5 years ago and asked me if I'd help on a woman's case, because they get mostly only men's cases. And so after I did, I said, "How'd you like some more women's cases?" And she said, "Sure." So I've been co-teaching with her and another attorney for the last 5 years. But yeah, there isn't much. I mean, there is a wonderful program on trafficking and some professors that work on that, but not enough on domestic violence, not even in social work enough. There's Mieko Yoshihama teaching domestic violence in social work, and I think 1 or two others, but not enough. Yeah. And it's such an epidemic.
It is an epidemic. Who else?
Hi, I am with the Michigan General Defense Committee, and we organize for and with the women at Women's Huron Valley Prison here in Ypsilanti, especially Crystal Clark. If you're interested in helping us out with organizing, come find us afterwards. So in the Glover v. Johnson case, you mentioned there was also like the physical conditions of the prison were really abhorrent. So I know that that case won access to resources like education and job training. Did it impact at all the physical conditions of the prison?
Yeah, so prior to 1977, all women who were state prisoners were sent to a facility that was managed by the city of Detroit, the Detroit House of Correction. And they were on a campus that was on the border of Plymouth and Northville. That was actually a result of reforms that club women in Detroit had led in the 1920s. So it was a very kind of gendered, intentional campus. But by the 1970s, it was really dilapidated and kind of terrible conditions and really overcrowded. So the state and the city of Detroit had been arguing about who would manage the female prison population. And so in 1977, the state finally opens Huron Valley, which was a state facility. So it was brand new, but my understanding is that it was quite austere and kind of a more bureaucratic and severe place to live in some ways, even though the building was new. And that was a result of overcrowding. And then one thing that happens with Glover to address the conditions and the overcrowding is that a lot of women were moved around a lot to try to appease the issue of overcrowding. So some women were rotated into the Kalamazoo County Jail, for example, which women thought was an additional form of punishment. They briefly opened an old boys reformatory and had incarcerated women there. There were a number of prisons that opened and closed in the period that Glover is being considered in the courts. And then I know now it's just Huron Valley, but there is a lot of movement in this 20-something years as to address the issue of overcrowding in prison conditions. But I don't think the state ever found a solution that actually improved the conditions. That's my understanding of the history.
No, and in the middle of it, they sent them to Florence Crane in Coldwater, which was built on a toxic waste site, and the women were systematically poisoned by the asbestos in the ceiling and the floor and in the water, and a lot of them continue to suffer really chronic health problems or have died of very strange, abnormal cancers that you don't see in other places because they were put in a place that was so toxic.
Hi. I'm actually fortunate enough to be in the class with the Toma Project with Mary and Ashley, but I was just wondering, you touched on having to go through those archival documents and track down all those court cases. How did you kind of balance, because for so long, or like politicians with their archival documents are so easy to find and they're very, here at the Bentley and everything. So how did you balance having that side of the story, but then also digging deeper into the voices that aren't heard and are very difficult to uncover, like the voices of the women inside?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the chapters are kind of organized around different aspects of women's movements in the 20th century, and then these court cases. So it moves chronologically, roughly. That's kind of how I tried to organize the book. But I think that I did try to balance, not balance, but like corroborate what was happening. So for example, the MDOC archives have documents about kind of the warden's papers or whatnot. And there's one example of when Gloria Richardson, who is the warden at Huron Valley, decided that she was going to implement a policy that meant women would have the same property rules that men had to follow in men's prisons. But what that meant for incarcerated women is that they would no longer be able to express themselves as individuals. Like jewelry or clothing items were all stripped really abruptly, and people were really mad about it. So in the MDOC documents, that is there, but it's a very kind of bare bones accounting of what happened. And then to kind of balance that out, Charlene Snow has some file cabinets in her basement that have a ton of affidavits that were written by incarcerated women that are talking about what it was like to kind of be in that assembly, hearing the warden issue those rules, about how mad they were, how it made them feel. And so all of those events are kind of corroborated in terms of the MDOC has kind of one version of it. And then what Kelly Little Hernandez, who's a historian, has written about the Rebel Archive, which is, from organizations or people who have documents or stories that haven't made it into archives. I definitely try to include that as well, and that's kind of one example of that. So I definitely tried to kind of pivot in terms of having these benchmarks of things that happened, but then I hopefully was able to add more by talking to people who lived through it or by accessing documents that haven't been donated and are in private collections. So I think that, I don't know if it's kind of a 50-50 balance, but it's a way to talk about events in a deeper way that is, that a number of people can remember what happened. So it's multiple sources, and it's definitely adding to what the state archives say.
Are there any other questions or comments from the audience?
Hello. Related to what was brought up about Women's Huron Valley and also Florence Crane, I was wondering in your kind of searching through archives and researching cases around clemency and how women have gotten clemency, if you came across cases of women getting out on medical clemency in Michigan. And I know that's something that a lot of us are thinking about around the black mold at Women's Huron facility and other kind of dilapidated prisons in Michigan. But I'm curious if you or anyone else in the room has done work or heard about that.
What little I know is that it's damn near impossible to get medical clemency in any prison system. You have to be hours away from death most times.
I think some new legislation has just come out. Do you know about it, Mary? Okay.
There is new legislation for release on medical parole. And they're also, when I was leaving 22 years ago, they had started going through files looking at the elderly prisoners. And so there was the thought, it took them forever, but there was the thought that they needed to do something about medically fragile and, folks that should have been released a long time ago. My dear friend was Ruthie Evans. And Ruthie Evans was from Ypsilanti. She had a second-degree murder case, just like mine. And Ruthie and I lived together for years and years and years, and she used to defend me all the time when people gave me a hard time about the suit. She'd say, "You leave her alone." She always stuck up for me. But in the end, Ruthie has had ovarian cancer, and they released her on parole, commuted her, and she went to her mother's home, which is real close to where I live in Ypsi now, and died on her mother's couch 6 months later. So medical parole is considered to be your last stop. There you go to a nursing home, or you go to a hospice, or you go home to die, which is terrible, because a lot of those old cases with the women were not only domestic violence, but they were People versus Aaron in 1980, and they were old felony murder rule cases where they didn't have to prove you killed anybody. If you were just with somebody and they did it, intent was inferred by the underlying felony. Also, I wanted to say a few words about Violet. I lived with Violet for years. Violet came home, and she had all kinds of family problems from the beginning. Her family sent her to prison. But she got in this terrible, terrible head-on car accident, and ended up in a nursing home and then passed away some years ago. So for those of us that made it out, many of us didn't survive reentry or very long after it. You know, I think about Cookie, and I think about, you know, a lot of the lifers that we live with that we love, that the whole thing was so dramatic and traumatic and horrible that, you know, they couldn't survive reentry. So when you're really talking about somebody being released, you're talking about from the time they're released until they die, because it stays with you. It's not going anywhere. You know, I still have the asbestos in my lungs. I still have kidney stones from the nitrates. I'm on penicillin now from them. You know, it wears in your soul. It's embedded in your physical being, just being tortured like that. Also, Juanita, I was really good friends with Juanita. I loved Juanita. Juanita's defense from the beginning, this is a family secret, was that her son actually committed the homicide. That she didn't commit it at all. That he framed her. And I was so happy when she got released, because, you know, there's women that you get locked up with that you know didn't do it. You know them. You listen to their stories, you know. And not that it matters, you know, as opposed to somebody that did do it, but it's just so unjust. Like somebody like poor Shar on the cover of that book. Shar came in 1977. I came in 1976 to Huron Valley. Huron Valley opened August 14th in 1977. I was one of the last prisoners out of Dihoko. They chained me with the escapees because I had sued the state. So I was the last bus out, changed with all the rebels. And I'll never forget it. And so as time went on, the situation with the women became more serious. And it was not just the folks in your book, but folks like Shar that really suffered. She had a horrible prosecutor. I had a horrible prosecutor, but I was a white girl. And I was I had favor from my family that went to the governor's office and tried to get me out. And Shar's Native American, Grand Traverse Bay, Ottawa. I love her dearly. And she was pregnant when she got arrested. She was with this guy named Larry that was a Marine that she trusted, that led her down the merry path to hell. And she still can't get out. And it's racial, it's gendered, it's everything you can think of that keeps women in prison. But there's so many stories of women that fought that aren't known. Like, I think about Stacey Barker. Stacey Barker appealed her case all the way through the Supreme Court and won. And she won the right for the first time in Michigan for a woman to have the right to defend herself, because self-defense never used to be able to be used as a defense at trial. And so a lot of the old domestic violence rules, they all fall under that. You don't have the right to defend yourself. But Stacey won that, and that changed everything. That was amazing. And, you know, I could go on and on with other stories about cases and, you know, things that the women won. But, you know, I just want to, tonight, honor them. There's so many that died. You know, there's so many women that just didn't survive. And there's so few of us left. My wife's generation, my wife did a bit. She did 8 years before I got locked up. We kind of caught each other's eye on the way out the door. I was coming in and she was going out. Her whole generation, they're all gone. She's the only one left. And so when you're talking about stories of women in prison and talking about, you know, survivors and what they've gone through, it's so freaking deep. I mean, it's deeper than anybody could even imagine. And, you know, and I thank you for all the work that you did all those years. You know, Bonnie's been to my house. She's been in my pictures and crawling around on my living room floor with me. You know, and it takes a lot to try and pull all that together because it's so screwed up, you know, on the record. They bury those records and seal them and burn them so that you can't sue them later on, so that the government can't come in and say, oh, look at this record from 1972, you know. But it's all to hide, you know, to keep from being held responsible for anything, to keep from being, you know, held liable. But it's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary, for that. I do have a new piece coming out. In case you're interested, some of you, it should be published any minute in the UCLA Journal of Gender and Law, and it has stories of many women who are in prison serving life now. And you can, it'll be online, open access, so you can read some of the stories and understand the overall injustice of women who are serving life sentences for homicide.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, thank you both.
Do we have time for one more?
We sure
and then
do.
that will wrap us up. Anybody who's want to ask the last question?
There's no question.
All right. Well, then, Bonnie, is there anything you'd like to say in response to all the wonderful things that we've been hearing from the audience before we close out?
Well, just thank you so much for hosting this conversation. It's been so great to be in discussion with you, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for your work on, incarceration in Michigan and women's rights. And it's just really nice to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you to the Ann Arbor District Library. And the folks from Literati, one of the best bookstores in Ann Arbor, are in the lobby, and they have copies of this beautiful book, and the author's here to sign it for you. So if you're going to get the book, now is the time to do it, and come see Bonnie to get it signed. Thank you so much, and read the book. It's worth the read.
Thank you. Bonnie, do you want to go to this table over there?